Tonight we're going to talk about the election and discernment of spirits within the context of the exercises. The existential context of the Ignatian election is important. What does that sentence mean? Existential context. It means the way the exercises take place in the actual giving and receiving of the retreat experience. It's not what somebody reads in the spiritual exercises. It's what some man or woman does in the spiritual exercises. So existential is distinguished from what? Intellectual, abstracted, borrowed experience, okay? So it's not something you read about or someone else has told you about. It's what you yourself undergo. Your experience is existential experience, existence, what's in the real. So the context, actually going through the exercises, is very important when you talk about discernment of spirits. And then, what is that context? We've been looking at it throughout the series of reflections together. Well, it's a context that emerges from prayer. What kind of prayer? Well, meditation, contemplation, the Ignatian repetitions, application of senses, the daily examen, and liturgical worship would be examples of what we mean by prayer. So prayer is what? Not univocal, but analogical. It's not only one way of praying, but there are many ways of praying, many ways of approaching union with God. Part of that context is also silence. Now, silence, as you know, not only physical silence, I don't talk, but psychological silence, I'm centered, I'm focused, okay? Spiritual silence, I am searching for the face of God. It's not the absence of, but the leaning towards, the searching for, the quest for. And focus. During the weeks of the exercises, remember how Ignatius says when you're in the first week, don't start thinking of the second week. And when you're in the infancy narratives, don't push baby Jesus to become an adult too soon. In other words, do progressively if you want to experience developmentally. You move along where you are. That's the focus. So the whole idea of going through weeks in the exercises and all the paraphernalia of first prelude and second prelude, the points, is gradually to get you into your own focus, your own way of centering on what it is that God is presenting to you at this time as a vehicle for understanding the way God wants to work within your life as you live it. Not as somebody else lives it or not as someone else has told you to live it, but as you live it. All of that is that context of the exercises, which is done so peacefully and with such a regard for the freedom of a woman or a man making the exercises that you can forget the very sophisticated layers of reality that are making up that experience. Now, they constitute what I would call the culture of the exercises, the symbols, the signs, the values, the realities that make up the life of the exercises. That's what we mean by culture. Remember questions that people would ask sometimes, why do we have the two standards? Well, after you've done the exercises and made them, you can think of other ways of representing the two standards, but the symbol in the two standards, the allegory itself, begins to yield meaning to you, and you realize that the exercises are a culture, a way in which the life of symbol becomes important too. Things stand for realities greater than themselves, deeper than themselves, more multifarious than themselves. So there is, in a sense, a poetry of the exercises, not in terms of its language, but more in terms of its movement, that allows you to see the levels and layers of significance and meaning. Now, you can't force people to do this. It's something that moves throughout the exercises. We say, why are you spending so much time on opening up this idea of the culture? Because you can't have discernment unless you've got the culture. Discernment is not a mechanical exercise that you impose on reality. It's an establishment of a reality in which discernment emerges from that reality. It's part of the reality. It's not the questions other people give you, it's your questions that trigger off discernment. That's why you have a conference with somebody else. Not to find out what you should think, but in order to uncover and to ruminate with someone else about what's actually happening. What are the movements, as Ignatius would say, in the exercises? Now, concomitant, going along with this structural context or culture, is the personal appropriation of the one making the retreat. You've got the culture there. As a person moves into it, that man or woman takes on this rhythm. So that there are how many ways to make the first week of the exercises? As many ways as there are people. There's not one way. And if people say to you, am I doing this right? You know that they're not, because they're looking over their shoulder, and you want them to lose the sense of trying to perform mechanically and begin to, experiment, move independently, find their own attractions, and really believe, for example, when Ignatius says, stop where you find fruit, he really means stop. Don't go on. But if I come back and tell my director that I haven't finished this whole exercise and I stayed at this one part, won't I fail the course? The answer is no, it's not that kind of reality. All of those are appropriations, allowing the reality to become yours, okay? That is, by this appropriation, the way a man or woman has developed, so that annotation 15, when the Creator and Lord reveals himself to the man or woman making the retreat, then the one who is guiding that man or woman in the retreat should get out of the picture and let God deal directly with that person, and that person deal directly with God. That's not a one-time experience, although its intensity can be focused on one time, but it's a pervasive ethics of the spiritual exercises that you find where God is leading you and you follow it. Okay? And the rhythm that this implies of personal grace, what does that mean? The way grace, the giftedness of God's relatedness to you, the way God, through some idea, some movement, some insight, some experience, some affectivity, pulls you towards God, and accountability to the guide. They have become habitual. Accountability to the guide, I want to be careful of that phrase. I don't mean that you're pleasing the guide. I mean you are forthright and honest and truthful in the way in which you depict and narrate your experience to the one who walks with you, so that he or she knows what's going on, okay? Now, I can't overemphasize for you that without this culture or environment of discernment, you can't discern. So when people say, well, I would like you to help me discern, and you start saying, well, can you pray every day? They say, no, but I'd like to discern. I said, no, you don't. Until you want to pray every day, you're not going to discern. You can mechanically go through things, but you're not going to be attuned to how your interior life is being touched by God. Your memory, your intellect, your will, your affections. You need space and time for that. Okay? Otherwise, you reduce discernment, again, to a tool. And it's not that. It is an instrument, but it's a whole complex of you're reacting to the overtures of God in prayer. This personal rhythm leads the one making the retreat to ask anew, what have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What will I do for Christ? Those were the three questions in the first exercise of the first week when before Christ on the cross, we asked that question. It wasn't for only one time, but the substance of that question recurs again and again as you make the exercises. Or given what I know now about who I am and who Christ is through my prayer, how will I follow him authentically? How will I follow him? Okay. That choice is the Ignatian election. Election means a decision made in the light of an ultimate relationship, but touching all the relationships of my life. What does that mean? It means I make a choice because I realize this is what God is inviting me to be or to do, and if I become or do this, it's going to have an impact on all the other things I do in my life. It's going to change my lifestyle in some way, okay? You say, can't it just change just a little part? And I say, well, then it's probably not an election. It might be a decision, but an election is a powerful response to the way God calls you, and it's going to touch other parts of your life. If you reaffirm, for example, that you really wish to be deeply married, not simply going through the conventions, but knowing all you know now, which you did not know when you first got married, about your spouse and the ups and downs of married life, the hard days and the good days, and suddenly in prayer you find a deeper saying of yes, then that's going to touch all your life. The way you talk about your spouse, the way you treat your spouse, the way you interpret the way the spouse reacts and interacts with you. The children that are part of this relationship, you begin to realize in a different dimensional way are gifts from God. See? All of those things get nuanced, changed, but they are impacted by the election itself. So the task of the guide or the companion, the one who gives the exercises, is to guide this decision, and then I would underscore this, not to make it or suggest what that decision should be. That's not the job of a guide or a director. It's to allow you making the retreat and God, the treasurer of the retreat, to be found and come together. Now, where did this Ignatian teaching on discernment come from? First, it came from Christian tradition itself, and it's important to understand that. Now, here's where Mike Buckley begins, and it's a little dense, but we'll unpack it. But it's so good, and it brings so much theological nuance together that I would like you to have it. All human beings who search for God want God to guide their lives. And Christians have been taught normatively to expect to be guided by the Spirit. All human beings, not just Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, sincerely atheists, something in a person's humanity, all those who search for God, even if they don't know what the name of God is. They want God to guide their lives. They want to have some sense of where they're going. You can have, for example, a non-believing alcoholic who is caught in the goodness of new life through Alcoholics Anonymous, talking to you about a higher power and not meaning God in the sense that you think of God, but an ideal, an inspiration, a desire to do good and to be good, but it's higher. It's bigger than the life I've been leading, and it judges the life I've been leading. It gives direction to the life I'm leading, even though I might not call it God. Okay, that's what Buckley's getting at in the first part. Then notice how he changes this. And Christians, among those human beings, have been taught normatively to expect to be guided by the Spirit. Normatively means it is the norm, it is the law of the life of the Christian to be guided by the Spirit. For freedom Christ set you free, Galatians 5:1. What does that mean? That freedom is the power of the Spirit working within me to choose what is the good God wishes me to embrace. Okay? That's a norm. It's not a law that we follow, it's a graced instinct that propels us. Okay? After a while, when you're driving a car and you see a green light and you go through the light, or you see a red light and you stop, you are normatively abiding by the signals. But it's become so much a part of your life that it's not a question of obeying the law, it's a question of keeping alive. And there's a difference. You're not mechanically stopping because you don't want to get a ticket, although that could be true too, but you're basically stopping because you don't want the car to get wrecked or you to get exiled into nothing, okay? Such expectations, both of a person and of the church itself, tend to put great emphasis upon religious experience. So, if you're saying you're guided by God, you're beginning to talk about religious experience. Go back to what we said at the beginning of the first paragraph, existential context. That's the experience, what's happening in life. And that means, and here's a description of religious experience that Buckley gives, an abiding interaction with God. Interaction. God speaks to me, I speak to God. Where do you have an example of that again and again in the exercises? In the colloquies. That's an interactive prayer, where God engages effectively. I feel love, I feel discomfort, I feel attraction, I feel withdrawal, I feel deep affection, I feel repugnance. You name these, but the naming of it doesn't give you the experience, you feel the experience, okay? That's affectivity. Affect, the emotions. And awareness, reflecting on this is what the emotion is. Think of the sophisticated reality when we begin to name our affections. Are you afraid? Are you eager? Are you hopeful? Are you repulsed? Are you turned on or are you turned off? That's a reflective act in which you name and identify what has moved you, okay? Those are two different things. Understanding, in which you look at that, being able to name a reality and say, it has a history. I have felt like this before, okay? Or I remember reading about this, and this is what it must mean. Or someone told me about it, and I know now what they were talking about. So awareness is being able to name it, and understanding is able to give it a context in which I relate it to other times when it's I or others have had this same kind of movement. And that leads to choice. I will go with this, I will run away from this. I will embrace this, I will thrust it from me. Prayer and action, reflecting on how God works in this in order that I might do something. Intimate personal relationships, ecclesial solidarity in the entire life of the community. So, there is throughout the exercises then a gathering of more and more rich, dense understanding of the ways in which God is moving through my memory, my intellect, and my will. For what I can recall that's happened before, I have an understanding of what it means now in a new context, and I can see how it influences the way I should move in the future. Okay. All that richness, that density, are some of the reasons why people who have no religious affiliation, when they get into understanding a little bit about the exercises, will talk about the psychological acumen of Ignatius. the insight he had into the way the human mind and heart work. Okay? There's no place in the exercises where all of this comes to a focus more intensely than when a man or woman in making the exercises begins to say, and what do I do about this? What is God asking of me? And that's why as a director, we walk in sacred territory when we come into this communication of the richness and density of how God is working within a woman or man, leading them to some choice to be or to do something out of this religious experience. Now, this emphasis becomes temptation. The emphasis on experiential stuff becomes temptation, something that could lead me away from rather than to God, only under the persuasion that the intensity of experience dissolves one from discretion, critical reflection, and the doctrinal content of Christian faith. What is Buckley saying there? It's dangerous territory because the very intensity of the experience can sometimes be translated as what I have to do, overwhelming me so that I choose out of what I feel what I should be or what I should do. A kid praying in a retreat before the crucifix and finding day after day that he or she is moved to really wanting to serve God and suddenly thinks the only way I can do that is by being a nun, a priest, or a brother. And they come to you, what do? You test that spirit. That's not at all an unusual experience, but you don't base a life decision on it. You need more time. You need more sifting out of the influences. You need more data in the person's own life and in the way the person can communicate that than you have right now. That would be an example. Trivial it looks like, but it isn't. This emphasis doesn't absolve you from discretion. Can you do this? Can you do this? Should you do this now? Do you have enough experience, talent, energy, stamina to do it? I'd like to be a Trappist. Do you know anything about them? No, but it sounds good, you know. You see what I mean? This happens. But what happens in life frequently enough is people say, we're in love. I can just feel it, and I know it. Do you know anything about him? Do you know anything about her? Have you met their families? What's the mother like? What's the father like? What do you share with one another besides attraction? I said, I don't have anything about against you it being sexual or being attractive or feeling good. I just don't think you make a decision on that. Those are two different realities. Huh? How many of us overeat because it looks good, it tastes good, and therefore it must be good, huh? No, it must be bad. As one of my doctors said, if it tastes good, Father, it's probably not good for you. Well, that's all you mean by discretion. When the force of an appetite clouds our decision-making apparatus. Critical reflection. What do I know about this? What are the constitutive elements of what I'm thinking I'm going to do? What do I know about this person, this movement? And the doctrinal content of Christian faith. This is a tricky one, but what it means is God generally does not undercut God's own revelation. Okay? I know that really stealing is wrong. I know what the church teaches about stealing. But this is different because I'm special. A lot of people have had that reasoning. I'm smarter than others. I know more about it. It's stealing now, but I'll pay it back some other day. Huh? There's a lack of critical reflection there. Okay? And so in this experience, it gives experience a priority over the unspeakable mystery that approaches human beings through experience. That's a very important phrase. Tony came over and said, I don't know what you're saying here. I said, well, I'm not saying it. Mike Buckley's saying it, but it's very important. And I had to do the same thing. What you're looking for in an experience in the retreat is the unspeakable. I can't find the words to describe that mystery, that higher power, that limitless horizon, that deep love that I experience, the enigma of Jesus that calls me out from the centuries and is not just a result of conditioning by other religious thinkers, but what I've discovered in my own prayer that draws me to follow him. All of those are instances of mystery. Mystery doesn't mean an unsolved problem. It means what Lonergan would call the limitless searching for truth. The limitless searching for truth. The deepest affection of my heart that I can't quite explain. And all of that approaches human beings, that mystery, through experience. It's the only way God comes. Moses had to see a burning bush. Moses had to hear the voice. Moses had to understand he had to take his sandals off. All of these were conditions involving touch, sight, sound, through which the mystery, which was God, spoke and made its appearance to Moses. Okay? But how does the voice in the bush describe itself? I am who am. God is our word. God is just, I'm being, I'm isness. I'm just whatever reality finally is, that's who I am. Now, if Moses said, I got it, God is a burning bush. I got it. God doesn't want us to wear shoes. I got it. Every voice I hear must be God speaking to me. It's subtle, but what you find in that epiphany in Exodus is an act of discernment. God is teaching Moses how to discern. I'm not the bush, I'm in the bush. You hear a voice, but it's not really who I am. It's me talking to you, but that's not who I am. And I do want you to know that this is sacred space, because I want you to take what I'm saying seriously, but it doesn't got anything to do about whether or not you're going to be calced or uncalced. Okay? And the danger is that you transfer this religious guidance of a single person or of an entire community to an unchallengeable subjectivity. That's what Lefebvre's did. Very good people who took a purchase on what it was to be Catholic, denied the reflection of the Church in Vatican II and said it doesn't apply to us. It's a meandering from orthodoxy, and took itself out of the body of the Church to create its own church. Okay? But people say, but are they living bad lives? No, they're probably living very good lives. Probably praying very intensely. But doing it by severing themselves from the life which is the church. Messy, dirty, full of political shenanigans, but still church. Underneath it, there's a mystery there. If you're looking for the pure reality that will have nothing that will ever disturb you, then you're not looking for the church that God founds, because it's the people of God. And they're all kinds. And once you look only for the pure, the good, and the smart, you've already exiled yourself from the human race. And there's no church without the human race. I don't care what some folks say. It'll be better when the church is smaller. We'll have people that will really do. No, it won't. It'll just be smaller. It won't be better. Just be smaller. The church is messy. Church is struggling. And if we don't have people that we learn to forgive as part of the church, then we don't know what church forgiveness is. Okay? So there's a lot of stuff here that Mike Buckley's getting at is important. Or sentimentality. Well, I hate to use exact, because my grandmother was terrific, but I remember as a kid my grandmother saying, benediction is the next thing to heaven. It means more to me than Mass. And I said, no, Grandma, you can't say that. The Mass is most important. You think whatever you want. I still like benediction better than Mass. Well, that's sentimentality, but boy, I wasn't going to touch it, you know. Or superstition. Superstition. Baseball players who haven't been to church in about 10 years will still cross themselves before they approach the plate. That's superstition. It's not people, oh, look, he crossed himself. Yeah, I said he probably wore his lucky jockstrap. It doesn't have anything to do with religiosity. You know, it's superstition, okay? Or excited enthusiasms. Everybody jumps on the bandwagon. Kill the Jews. Kill the Jews. They're Christ killers. People have used that enthusiasm to do all kinds of horrible things. None of that, and that's what discernment cuts through. It's cleaning up the influences so that the purity of God's intention can become my intention. God wants me to be a loving person. What is the loving choice I make in these circumstances? That's clean. Love the Lord your God with all your mind and heart and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. The hardest commandment there is, because we keep unpacking and trying to find out what it means. But once in a while, when you live it and discover it, it's clean. You know what it means. You know? Okay. The sense of ambiguity, of the tension between longing and temptation. I long for God, and then I gradually long for a God that I made after my own image and likeness. Remember how we began these reflections on the exercises? The temptation to make a God of your own image, false gods. It's found both in Pauline and Johannine theology. In the earliest canonical documents of the Church, Paul directs the Christian community, do not quench the Spirit, do not despise prophetic utterances, but test everything, retain what is good. That's discernment. You honor the experience, you test the experience, and you look for that experience to give you guidance. The first letter of John counsels, Beloved, do not trust every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they belong to God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. So religious experience is almost always an equivocal reality, inherently ambiguous. You may say, what do you mean? I don't know whether this experience leads me here or there. I don't know whether it's from God, or part of it is from God, and part of it is something that I then impose on this experience without really sorting it out as well as I should. Every Christian freedom, for example, can be twisted into a pretext for evil. All influences need to be tested prayerfully to determine their authenticity, and to meet this need, the community must be gifted with the discernment of spirits. Why do so much time? Because there's nothing new that Ignatius is saying about a tradition. He's adding to the tradition, reflecting on the tradition, working within the tradition, but he is true to a tradition that is part of our heritage, that God will work in our lives, God will move us, God will guide us, God will impel us towards a way of acting, but we still are required what? To test out what is of God and what is not of God. What is of God, what is not of God. Second, right at the bottom of the page, from the personal experience of Ignatius Loyola as narrated in the Acta, or the autobiography, which recapitulates this older and wider Christian tradition and inspires and guides his teaching of the exercises, his letters, and the Constitution. So we have a tradition there. How does this discernment operate within the spiritual exercises? First, discernment lies within the dynamics of Christ's life choices. Christ is presented by Ignatius as the great discerner. In many ways, the second week is not reflecting, not contemplations on the life of Christ. You don't have everything Christ did in the Gospels repeated in the second week of the exercises. But you do have pivotal moments of his decision-making. pivotal moments of his decision-making in the second week of the exercises. And that's why when people use other gospel sayings, that's good to do. But you have to make sure that there are other gospel sayings that highlight the decision-making of Jesus. Okay? So within our prayer of looking at Christ and at his ministry that's narrated in the gospel, we see Christ the discernment. Discernment is part of the gospel contemplation that Ignatius proposes to the one making the exercises. That's one reality. By looking at Christ, we learn what discernment is. Who do people say that I am? Was that a real question, or was it just a phony question Jesus was asking so he'd be self-dramatizing? I believe with Rahner and Lonergan that the humanity of Jesus was developmental, that the mystery of his Godhead was embedded in his reality, and gradually his self-consciousness of who he was revealing itself to him. As I think most people get a better and better idea as they move through life, who they are, what they are meant to be, what really is their authenticities, huh? So, I think the question of Jesus was real. They're kind of catching something there. I really need to know from the people who have watched me and been with me and heard me and seen me, what is God saying to you about me? Because that's going to be helpful to me. And I think that's what good people do when they're discerning. They try to get a picture of how they come across. That's why we fill out forms that evaluate people for a job or for ordination or for marriage, to get some idea of how others read what we think we are and get another view of who we are. Second, in a series of pastoral directives called Introduction to the Making of an Election, and notably the 2 sets of rules for discernment. And that's what we're going to go through right now. There are 2 sets of rules. The first set of rules has 14. Regulate doesn't mean you have to obey these laws. They're reflections on the way in which one can move, given 2 different contexts. The first week context is you can have 2 kinds of people in the first week. Those who are trying to get out of basically a sinful life and live a better life, and those who have been leading a pretty good life but want to lead a more reflective, more dedicated Christian life. Both of them fall under what we call the first week experience. And so you find 2 kinds of rules in this 14 rules of the first week of the exercises. And then in that paragraph, I lay out the ways in which that can be worked. What is important there is the difference between consolation and desolation, rules 3 and rules 4. Consolation is marked not by intensity of feeling. That calls attention to something happening. But consolation is marked by the direction of that feeling. Where does it lead you to? Where does it lead you to? Okay? Same for desolation. Consolation leads you to God and the things of God. Desolation leads you to away from God and away from the things of God. It's as simple as that. Now, sorting it out can be very difficult sometimes, you know. A person can say, I know I've been in desolation. I have felt very lonely. I felt that I'm doing a lot of things by myself, and I keep going to God and asking for help. That is probably one of the most complex statements you can have. Is that consolation or desolation? I don't know. If it's leading you to God, that's consolation. If you feel restless and fidgety and self-doubts, that can be desolation. So when you're working with somebody, you better be careful about how you spread these 2 apart. You don't say, oh, that's desolation. Don't let it bother you. No, bother it. I think it should bother you that you don't want to lose God, but you feel kind of uneasy about it all. And you want to probe and say, why? What is it that you don't want to bring before God? and you want to save. And sometimes you'll find the person will talk and finally say, I'm afraid of what God will ask of me. So I want God. I want to be with God, but I don't want God to ask me anything. Okay? That's not infrequent. Not infrequent. And what God might be asking is something, it can sound as simple as, God doesn't like the prejudice that guides so much of your life. Of course you're not uneasy. You are uneasy. You don't like people of different colors, coming from different nations. There's a deep-rooted xenophobia in your heart that doesn't allow the universality of God to enter into it. And until you give that up, you're not going to be peaceful. It's hidden, it's conventionalized, it's made appropriate, but it's not good. You systemically are on the back of one of your kids. The kid can't do anything right. And until you get rid of that a priori need you have to correct instead of accept, you're not going to find peace with God, not the way you're looking for it. Not a big thing, can be a little thing, but it can gnaw away at the peace we want to have. So you don't have to look for big things, but you have to pay attention to what is happening seriously in your life at that part. Okay, that's the first week. The 8 rules for the second week are governed. It's a different thing, a different religious reality. They're much more subtle, and they deal with the experiences of being deceived or tempted under the appearance of good. John of the Cross, the good person is tempted by the good, not the bad. Okay. Tempted by the good. At such a juncture, it is no longer enough to know how to deal with the attraction to an obvious evil or with the repugnance for the good. Okay, that's the first week. These rules for the second week distinguish the consolation in which there is no danger of deception, when one is drawn wholly into the love of God without commensurate thoughts or images, from the consolation mediated by ideas or imagination, in which deception is possible. Okay? I really know that God wants me to be a social worker. And therefore, no matter what my family says or how much money they poured into my degree in the business school, I'm going to be a social worker. Okay? I prayed over it. I've seen what happens to people who don't have directions, or are poor, or trampled down upon, or are disregarded and marginated in our society, and I want to do something about that. Okay? So therefore, I'm going to abandon my 3 years of study, and I'm going to go into something new. Okay? Discern that spirit. Did you ever think that maybe you could do more for people by being a good business person, managing a nonprofit organization out of your smarts, than you could be by getting into the streets, which you've never visited yet anyway? Okay. Now, that's not unusual. Not at all unusual. People get carried away by a good, and a good for me, and a good for society. And this is probably what God wants me to do. I said, it could be, but I don't know that yet. I think we need more time, more discernment, okay? One must attend to the attraction toward the morally good by considering the beginning, the middle, and the end of the entire process. These rules of the second week, these 8 rules in the second week of the exercises, for the second week of the exercises, outline the progress of deception disguised in apparent consolation. The good person is tempted by the good. Therefore, all the more reason you have to be careful about putting people in the second week who aren't ready for the second week. Because they can still be tempted by first week stuff, and they think they're making second week decisions. Okay. You say, oh, how that doesn't happen. Why do you think so many people have left priesthood and religious life? Because they did make good decisions, but they weren't making good decisions, not always, but frequently, out of what God was calling them to be. And sometimes when you deal with enough of those people and they suddenly realize as they're going through, reviewing their life and so on, they'll say, I never had a vocation. My mother did. And I didn't want to disappoint her. My father did. I didn't want to disappoint him. I wanted to do the better thing, and therefore I thought this was harder. You hear that? I wanted to do the better thing, and therefore I did this because it was harder. The harder thing is never the better thing. It's just harder. You don't make a discernment on it. If I just gave you 3 sentences, and I have spent most of my life in Jesuit formation, and I can tell you people get screwed up on one of those 3. My mother's vocation, my father's vocation, the harder thing is the better thing, and therefore I ought to do it. And I really want to be perfect, and this is the perfect life, right? No, there is no perfect life. It's all subjective. It's what's perfect for you. What's you? But the church, as I said, the church holds up an ideal that never works until you put it into the life of people. And how do they live that? The tyranny of the should is neurotic. Karen Horney, Neurosis and Human Growth. Read that chapter again. And see how important it is in the way people make decisions. Okay? It's good stuff. These outline the process of deception disguised as apparent consolation, a frame of procedure whereby the true and false consolations can be distinguished at the terminus of their influence. Where does this go? Big words, but it means, Ignatius says, where does this lead? Where does this lead? Huh? Is it good to move a crowd? Is it good to have the ability to speak in such a way that you empower people with some sense of their authority and they want to live for an ideal? Is that a good thing? Yes. Can it be used for a bad end? Look at Hitler. Look at Hitler. And at the midst of it, somebody will say, you can't say it's wrong. Look at all these people, how their hearts have been touched, and they want to do something for Germany. And yeah, they want to kill the Jews. Huh? They want to follow somebody who's going to lead them into war and destruction and bring devastation upon them as a culture and a people. The demagogue always works with something which is good, the power to sway, and works towards an end which is basically, once you stay with it for a while, destructive. So this is happening socially and individually all the time. What Ignatius has got together is saying, in a time of prayer, look at where these things lead. Lead. Okay. Now, I'm going to say just a bit about comments on making an election. Discernment of spirits, the rules for the first week and the second week, are different from making an election. An election is the process that a man or woman goes through in the exercises. They've been discerning all through the exercises and been helped in that. But when you start coming to an election, it's that point where they say, what is God asking me to be or to do? To be or to do. What is a to be question? Should I be a religious? Should I be single? Should I be a lay person who is single, or should I be married? If I'm married, should I marry Eleanor or Elaine or Yvonne or Harry or Hubert or Heward? You know, you go through a specificity. Generally, people don't do that. In many decisions in their life, they spend more time on buying a car than they do on choosing their mate. So, well, no, that's not true. I said, I think it is true. I think that people don't slow down sometimes and say, get to know each other. I don't mean your bodies, and I don't mean your affectivity, but what do you really like? What's the family like? What things do you share together about books, movies, prayer, life, so that as you grow older together, you will not lose an interest in how you can grow together, not separately. Those are important questions. you can't dampen all the enthusiasms and the romance that people had. Those are the way God works too. I'm not at all saying that. But all the stuff that people think are nuisances in marriage preparation, if they were done right by humane people, would be so helpful in a young couple coming to know themselves better. That they don't do it well, and that they get crappy questions and jam it down people's throats, and they send them to dumb marriage preparation groups, and then they say, well, we do it. You didn't do it. It's not a discerning process. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is, you know. But people can get so washed away in things that are not the essential about, will you really want to grow old with this person? Like a religious community, if you want to know whether you want to join it, go visit their infirmary. How do they treat their old? How do they care about them? Do you really want to be part of this outfit as you start losing your teeth and you can't gradually move the way you used to and you creak, you know, when you can't remember things? How do they treat people like that? Do you want to be part of that group? How do they talk about one another? Is it with respect and reverence and understanding? Yeah. When you leave a group, would you like to be the first one or the last one to leave this group? I've had to tell people who are with you in a group never want to be the first one to leave because you'll make fun of them the way you have everybody else. Do you want to live like that? That no one trusts who they are with you because you will ridicule who they are. So those are good questions. Part of the discernment process is to say you look at the existential reality. In this making of the election of to be or to do, Ignatius says there are 3 times. Instantaneously, I know what God wants me to do. And he uses the example of Saul on the way to Damascus. Saul, Saul, as a vision, this is what you have to do. I asked my tertian director, great spiritual director, Paul Kennedy, whom I've mentioned before, I said, Father, do you have any experience of this first time of making an election when you know instantaneously? Yes, he said. I knew a woman who was a dress designer in London and was very famous. And she was walking by a Carmelite church and heard distinctly a call, go into this chapel. And she went into it and she said, I'm going to be a Carmelite. She said, I didn't know anything about Carmelites, never heard the word before, but I had no doubt that this was what God was calling me to. Then he said, and you are going to go and give her novices their retreat, and I want you to talk to her. Well, it was remarkable, because that's really what happened to her. Now, there was a lot of purification along the way. She had to go through novitiate and all the other stuff. But gradually she realized that the core of why she came was something she could not explain to anybody else, but was hers. It was tested, it was purified, it was redirected, but it was hers. Huh? Okay, that's first time kind of experience. Second time is the affective movement, and there's some debate among Ignatian scholars. Was this preferred by Ignatius or not? I think it was preferred. It's a time of affectivity. You're basically at peace and you feel movements more one way than towards another. I really would like to be single. I really would like to have a family. I would like to be able to have somebody who would hold me and say he or she loves me. These are things that I see are very good, and I really see them not as merely attractions, but as deep existential calls about the kind of person I want to be. Now, let me pray about that a little bit more, but basically it's affectivity. I'm moving towards a decision of a way of life that I find deeply satisfying, not only because it's comforting, but because it responds to something deep in my own psyche and my history and my spiritual ambitions that I would like to be. Do I know anybody like that? And my sister. She said, I always wanted to be a mother. I wanted to have children. I thought this was very who I was meant to be. And God tested it by giving her a tough marriage. But she said, but my kids are what God called me to be. That's the second time. Third time is you are peaceful, but you don't feel any movement one way or the other that's very pronounced. So you do two ways that Ignatius has, both of them involving reasons. And you have all the paraphernalia that some people put to the forefront of discernment, which really should be after you know there's not an instantaneous understanding of how I'm called, and there is no strong affective movement towards how I should be called, then you use this way of reasoning. So that basically is the way Ignatius lays out the rules for discernment. And then the election. So what we're going to do, and what we will do in weeks 3 and 4, is look at how that discernment is confirmed in the life of Jesus, and it becomes a confirmation process in the life of the one making the exercises. Now, are there any immediate questions before we do something with the little time we have here?
That's a very simple question. Most of the time, people will come to you and they will like your help to guide them to discern about a situation. And it happens most of the time also that we do know that discernment needs time and space. But when they come to you, you realize there is not enough time to go through a process of discernment. What do we do in this case?
Well, you give me a very specific case, and I think that's what happens is when you say there's not enough time, there always is enough time. It's God's time, not our time. And so while there might not be the space of a 30-day retreat, you can ask the person, well, let's put it this way. You start in saying, what is the decision you have to make? And when do you have to make it? How much time can you spend on opening yourself to the influence of God in making this decision? And then you have to work from what the person has within that time. But you have to believe, and so does the person, that within that time God can lead them. Now you might have to say as you go through the process that God is going to help you take the 1 or 2 steps you have to take to begin to reflect on what next steps have to go. But you have to start someplace. And this might be the initial way in which you begin to see the way that God leads you towards being more and more open to where God wants to lead you more permanently. For example, person can, what I find hard is unless you have a case, you're talking in all these abstractions about if you have more time or not time. Like if a person says, I've been given 2 weeks to make a decision about whether I should stay in this job or I should take a job in another city. It influences my family and my kids and so on, and I don't have much time. I don't have time to go away for a retreat. What can you help me do in 2 weeks? You guys, and you do what you can do. You try to bring them to peace and try to say, at this time before God, as you gather all the data together, how does your spouse feel? How do the kids feel? The pros and the cons. Now try to put them to one side and maybe try to take at least a weekend in which you begin to look before the Lord making his decisions, how you feel about your making your decision. You try to find an appropriate scripture passage that the person can connect with. And maybe all that the person can say is finally, he said, I'm not real clear. I feel more peaceful than I did, but I don't know whether God wants me to stay or to go. But in prayer, as I look at it, the part of me that wants to try something new, venturesome, and creative says maybe I should move. This is the time to move. The part of me that wants to be safe and secure and not jeopardize the economy of my family says I should stay. Then I might say, well, how can you talk that over with your wife and come to some understanding of how she feels a little bit better? Can you take another little part of a day and begin to sort out which of these two, in the light of what your wife says, because she's the one who's going to have to live this with you, but it's your decision, which of these do you find more appealing? And I don't know what the person's going to say. The person might say, I really want to take this risk. I think it is a risk and I'm scared. I think that my wife is willing to go along with it, and it might not work out, but I think I have to try it, that there are other things going on. That's all you can do. Now, what if the wife says, or the spouse, the husband might say to his wife, who's the business person, I can't move. I can't do this to me. I can't do it to the kid. So then you have a non-negotiable in which you have to say, I don't think you can do a lot right now without it really injuring your marriage, and you have to look at that. But you have to be very careful so that it's not your decision, and you're not pushing a person more one way than the other, and the decision really is the person's. But the more other people are involved in your decision, the more you have to make sure they consult so they understand what that person's choice will mean for the other persons that are related to them, family, wife, husband, whatever it is, spouse. So that's why I say it's so hard, but I think you can do something so that the decision, even if it's tentative, and most decisions are going to be tentative, That is, with the data I have here and now, but the demands I have to make a decision in a very limited amount of time, it seems to me that I can make a prayerful decision, knowing that new data might come, I might change, but at least I've done what I can here to make this a prayerful decision. Sometimes it's all you can do. But what I'm trying to say is, but it can be a discerning decision, which is not necessarily a full-fledged discernment. You're praying over it, you're trying to reflect on it, you're looking at the ramifications of it, and you go along with it. I had someone who was asked to be chair of a retreat house board. He already had a big business, and he had diabetes himself. His one daughter had a serious medical condition, but could function very well as a student. But he wasn't sure whether he wanted to take this added responsibility. And he had maybe about a month to let people know whether he would keep his name in for running for chair. Well, he looked at both sides, the cons and the pros. He was running a business. He didn't have time to go away and pray. But gradually he came to an understanding that he would not have the time he had before. But what he would have is if he watched TV, cut out the TV and a couple other things, he really did have time where he could really be a good chair, and he had imagination and creativity, and he felt that would be a gift to give, and he also would be challenged. So he finally resolved what he would do. He would put his name in to be elected the chair of the board, if that's where it went, realizing that there was a quality of risk about this, but his wife was willing to make it with him. Less time at home, more demands, stuff like this. Well, actually, it's a success story because it worked out very well for him. It brought out qualities that he didn't know he had. The side effect of it was that once he got into the chair, he said, now will you lead me through a 19th annotation retreat to be a good chair? Will we work at this? I said, okay, yeah, we'll do that together. And that was he's off now, and he did a terrific job as the chair of this retreat house. But again, you work within those constraints, and you clean as a guide to the fact that God is good in giving, and God will give what this person can be open to in the reality of the time constraints you have. I mean, the question's a very good one, and it's a good example. And you sometimes don't have all the stuff Ignatius lays out here in a busy schedule to do the kinds of long, reflective process that you'd have in the spiritual exercises. Then you try to encapsulate them as much as you can. Context, process, guidance, consultation, and affectivity. You adapt it as well as you can. That's all you can do sometimes. Any other question the person wants to ask?
Usually when someone comes to you and I want to say a couple comes to you and they want to be married, they've already decided they're not going to change. So is it too late?
No, because I don't think it's never, God's time is never too late, you know. But I would say, when that's happened, I'd say, that's good, and I want to be with you, I want to help you as much as I can. Then I would use this technique. I'd say, what readings do you want to use for your wedding liturgy? And they said, well, we haven't. I said, well, I want you to read through them, and you come back, and we'll talk about them, and tell me why you want that. Then I would use what they've chosen to talk about how that illumines for them the kind of marriage they want to have. And sometimes it might be, they say, well, we'd like to go out for dinner. Will you? I said, sure. Over dinner when it's an appropriate time. You don't want to give them all indigestion, but you say, now you chose those readings to talk about what kind of things are growing in you about the type of people you'd like to be as you get older in your marriage. What would you like to share together? What makes you happy? You chose this reading from the Song of Songs. Was that because it was beautiful? Or did it say something? And they'll say something, well, you know, I like this line, here comes my lover leaping. And I just, and they both start laughing. She said, I really like the fact that he's got energy and he's got pep and he makes me do things that I wouldn't want to do, that I'm afraid to do. And I hope he never loses, I do, she said, I hope he never loses this idea of pushing me to do things that I wouldn't do by myself. Then they talk a little bit more. So I start with generally something they have to have anyway, readings, something that they choose, which readings, and something that they get to talk about that begins to move a little bit more into their interiority they have as they enter into this marriage. And if you're lucky and you know the families, you can ask something about the family. What have you learned from your dad and mom about the way you think a marriage should work? And have you shared that with one another? Have you talked about that? You don't have to do it with me, but I really think you ought to do that. So you deepen and find some creativity in transforming what is required into now what is desired. The readings are required. But which ones do you want? Why did you choose them? Where do they lead you as you think about them in prayer? And then you try to get them, you know, not all of these things are good, but you try to, when they make a kind of weekend retreat or reflection, who are the people that moved you? You get them to talk about the experience with you. What did it mean? Where did it come from? For me, one of the things that I find, sometimes you have kids, you have young people, there are not so many kids anymore, they're getting marrying older, but a young couple will come and you notice that they never ask you to go out for dinner. That's been always interesting to me. It's the ones who ask you to go out for dinner, to have a little more time to talk over a meal, that you begin to see that they want something out of this companionship that's going to be enduring and good, and they like to talk about that with you in some way or other. And to find a way you can do it without being intrusive is, I think, important in all of that. But that's one of the things I would do, is to use what they have to have to something they want to have, and then to find out why, and to begin to tap into it. That doesn't guarantee it's all going to work out well, but it's a step, and it's a helpful step. Well, I don't want to get off there, but one of the things I always try to bring out in the homily is the fact that it's never their wedding, it's our wedding. That they would not be there without all kinds of people that have placed confidence and trust and hope in them. And that they have a wedding in front of their families and their friends because they want them to be part of it. What is it you want to continue to share and have other people be part of the rest of your life? What kind of a home would you like to have? Who are the people you want to have in your home? Sometimes you can do it by something that they can read quickly. But to get the idea of moving out of it's just being their experience to being in our experience is going to help them. You know. So you'd work with what you got. Yeah. Okay? All right, that's enough. Thank you.